The dress had cost 3 winters of saving. Rose knew this because she had helped her mother hide every copper coin inside a small clay jar tucked beneath the loose floorboard near the hearth. Coin by coin, season by season, for years. And when her mother died, she kept saving. Not because she knew exactly what for, but because there was something in the act of keeping that felt like keeping the woman alive inside her. Now the dress was on her body, and Rose finally understood what it had been for. It was simple, compared to the gowns worn by the other women filling the great hall of Draveth. Undyed linen in a washed gray blue, with hand-stitching along the neckline. Small, slightly crooked wildflowers embroidered in cream thread, the work of hands that no longer saw very well when they sewed it. But it was the most beautiful thing Rose had ever worn. And that night, to her, that was enough. The great hall smelled of aged timber, of resin burning in the iron sconces bolted to the dark stone walls, of warm spiced wine being poured into cups along the long banquet tables that ran the length of the room. Pack banners hung from the ceiling beams. The Raven of Draveth, the Stag of Holt, the Coiled Serpent of Venner. The smaller packs pressed along the edges, their members drinking quietly while they watched the representatives of the greater houses move through the hall with the effortless arrogance of those who had never needed to justify their presence to anyone. Rose was from Cinderfen, a pack so small that their banner, a willow branch on ochre linen, had been hung in the corner nearest the entrance, half hidden behind a stone column. No one from Cinderfen had received a formal invitation to a recognition banquet in 2 full cycles. This time, their presence had a specific reason. Edric Draveth had asked her to come. Rose would not have called it a promise, technically. He had not knelt before her, had not pressed his fingers to the back of her neck in the form of the old bonding gesture. But he had said the words, "Come to the banquet. I will claim you in front of everyone." He had said it 3 weeks ago, on the bank of the river that divided Cinderfen and Draveth territory, while the sun dropped behind the tree line, and the 2 of them stood side by side watching the water move. There had been something in that moment that felt real, that felt solid enough to build a hope on. She built one. Now, standing near the column that half hid her pack's banner, Rose watched Edric from across the hall. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with chestnut hair pulled back at the nape of his neck. As the son of Draveth's Alpha, he was being courted by 3 families that very evening. She could see it in the calculated smiles of the fathers, in the daughters positioned around him like pieces in an old game. Edric smiled back at all of them. He sipped his wine with the ease of a man who knew the world would not end before he made his choice. "He hasn't even looked over here yet," murmured Senna, standing at Rose's side. Senna was from Cinderfen too. She had grown up on the same dirt road, had slept in the same cottage during the winter the roof caved in, had cried at the same funeral when Rose's mother was buried beneath the oak at the edge of the village cemetery. She was the only person in that hall who knew Rose in truth. Not the dress, not the hope, but the clay jar under the floorboard and the coins counted 1 by 1. "He'll look," said Rose, more to herself than to her friend. "Rose." Senna. The name was spoken firmly, but without sharpness. It was enough. Senna closed her mouth and turned to watch the center of the hall as well, where Draveth's Alpha had risen from the head chair and struck his metal cup against the table to call for silence. The moment of recognition had arrived. It was an old custom. At the recognition banquet, males could declare their choices before all attending packs. These were not permanent bonds. Those required longer rituals, exchanged blood, promises spoken beneath the moon. But it was the first step, the public declaration, the announcement that a real intention existed. Rose's heart did not race. It simply stopped. Edric rose from his seat. His gaze swept the hall. Rose straightened without meaning to, her shoulders adjusting on instinct, her chin lifting slightly. "Look at me." The thought moved through her like a wire pulled tight and about to snap. "Look at me, Edric." He looked, but not at Rose. "I declare interest in the daughter of Alpha Sorn, of Venner," he said, his voice projected to reach every corner of the hall. Mira Sorn, to be presented before the pack. The world did not fall apart. That was the cruelest part. The world continued exactly as it had been. The torches kept burning, the wine kept flowing, the conversations in the background continued in murmurs and laughter. A young woman with dark hair and a gown stitched with silver thread walked to the center of the hall wearing a smile that was not quite a smile, but a calculated victory. Her father applauded. Draveth's Alpha nodded with approval. And Edric, who had said, "Come to the banquet. I will claim you in front of everyone," looked at Mira Sorn with the eyes of a man who had made the choice that was convenient for his pack, for his name, for the alliance between Draveth and Venner that had likely been arranged long before any sunset by any river. Senna placed her hand on Rose's arm. Rose did not pull away, but she did not squeeze back either. She stood still, the gray-blue linen dress against her skin and the crooked flowers embroidered by the hands of a dead woman, and breathed in once, then again, until the burning behind her eyes receded just enough for her to think clearly. Not here, not in front of them. "I'm going to leave," she said, her voice low and completely steady. "Rose, you don't have to. I want to leave while I can still walk straight." She released the air slowly. "Will you walk with me to the door?" They moved along the edge of the hall. Rose kept her pace even, her face neutral, her eyes fixed on the heavy wooden door at the far end. No one paid attention. She was from Cinder Fen. Invisible before, invisible now. At least that much had remained constant. She was perhaps 10 steps from the door when it opened. Not the way servants opened doors. Not the careful, quiet push of someone entering without wanting to disturb. The door swung open with the weight of a man accustomed to entering anywhere, as though the space had been built to receive him. A rush of cold night air swept into the hall, carrying the smell of pine, of dark forest, of wet earth, and something else. Something Rose felt before she saw it. A scent her mind could not name, but her wolf recognized immediately as power. 3 men walked in. The first was broad across the shoulders, and wore a slightly crooked grin. The expression of someone who had just heard the punchline of a story the rest of the room hadn't caught yet. The second was leaner, with amber eyes that swept the hall at the precise speed of someone conducting an assessment while pretending not to. The third, the one who entered last and stood slightly behind the other 2, was not smiling. Theron. Rose did not know his name yet, but she knew immediately what he was, the way an animal knows when it stands before something larger than anything it has encountered before. Black hair braided and drawn back, eyes a shade that seemed to shift with the torchlight. Deep blue one moment, storm gray the next. Dark leather across his chest, crossed straps buckled at the center. A black, fur-lined cape still shifting from the momentum of his entrance. His wrists were wrapped in leather bracers riveted with dark metal. But it was not the armor that carried weight. It was the silence he brought with him. When Theron entered the hall, the conversations did not stop, but they hesitated. One beat of collective instinct, the kind wolves felt even when they wished to ignore it. The involuntary recognition of a hierarchy that did not need to be announced aloud, because it was written in something older than any word. Draveth's Alpha was on his feet so quickly he nearly knocked over his cup. Rose had stopped walking. She had not planned to stop. Her feet simply refused the next instruction. She stood there, 3 steps from the exit, with Senna at her side and the linen dress against her skin, while the most powerful man to have entered that hall, and quite possibly any hall she would ever stand in, looked forward with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Then his eyes dropped, and landed on Rose. It was not a long look. It lasted less than the span of a single breath, but it was complete, the way wolves scent without appearing to scent, taking in information in layers that the human eye cannot register, but the wolf inside always does. Her smell, her posture, the plain dress, the expression she had carefully constructed over the last 5 minutes to keep everything sealed inside. He saw through all of it, Rose did not know what he saw, but she felt, with a certainty that had no explanation, that she had been truly seen. Perhaps for the first time in that hall. Perhaps for the first time in longer than she could name. And exactly when she gathered herself to take the final 3 steps to the door and disappear into the cold dark outside, where she could finally let the burning in her eyes become whatever it needed to become, without a single soul from Dravethpak as witness. The man with the storm-gray eyes turned slightly toward the broad-shouldered companion beside him and said something too low to be heard across the room. The companion looked at Rose and smiled. The companion's name, Rose would learn later, was Calder. But in that moment, all she knew was that he was walking toward her, directly, without hesitation, cutting a path through the edge of the hall with the kind of unhurried confidence that suggested he had never once in his life worried about whether his approach would be welcome. He was large the way a draft horse was large, not elegant, but undeniably present, and the grin he wore had not faded since the door opened. The amber-eyed one followed 2 steps behind, hands loosely clasped at his back, studying the room with the patient expression of a man cataloging everything he observed for future reference. Senna made a small sound beside Rose. Not quite a word. More the sound a person makes when they realize the ground has shifted beneath them, and their body registers it before their mind does. Rose did not make any sound at all. She stayed very still. "You were leaving," said Calder, stopping in front of her. Not a question. An observation offered with the slight lift at the end that made it feel almost like an invitation to explain herself. "I was," Rose said. "Pity." He tilted his head, and something in his eyes shifted from amusement to something more genuine, though not less unsettling. "The hall smells better on this side." The amber-eyed man stopped beside him and gave Calder a look of mild, practiced patience. "What he means," he said to Rose, his voice quieter and more deliberate, "is that you caught our attention. He simply lacks the vocabulary to say so without sounding like he's appraising livestock." "I have excellent vocabulary," Calder said, unbothered. "You use the word pity. Strategically." Rose looked between them. She had the distinct feeling that this exchange had happened many times before, in many halls, and that neither of them found it particularly tiring. She also had the feeling, sharper now, more pressing, that whatever was happening was not the kind of thing that happened to women from Cinderfen at recognition banquets. Women from Cinderfen were not approached by anyone on the side of the room closer to the door. They were not spoken to at all, most of the time, unless someone needed the wine refilled. "I don't know who you are," she said, because it was true, and because she had always found that leading with truth was more efficient than pretending to knowledge she didn't have. The amber-eyed man seemed to appreciate that. Something in his expression settled into a kind of respect that was still calculating, but no longer concealed. "Fen," he said, touching his own chest briefly. "And this is Calder. We ride with the king's company." The words landed quietly, but their weight was not quiet at all. Rose kept her face still. She was getting better at that. "The Alpha King," she said. "The same." She did not look toward the place where Theron had last stood. She could feel him there, the way you feel a fire without turning toward it. A warmth that was not entirely comfortable, that your skin registered before your mind gave it permission. She kept her eyes on Fen. "Then I imagine you have better things to do than speak to an Omega from a pack without a seat at the main tables," she said. Calder made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an exhale. "She's direct," he said, to no one specifically. "I noticed," said Fen, and then to Rose. "That's not an insult, by the way. Direct is rare in a room like this. Most of what we've heard tonight has been dressed up in so many layers of courtesy, it stopped meaning anything 3 sentences in." Senna had gone very quiet beside Rose. The kind of quiet that meant she was watching everything with the intensity of someone memorizing details to recount later, which was a Senna quality Rose had known since childhood, and found, right now, oddly grounding. Rose became aware, in her peripheral vision, of a change in the hall's current. It was subtle, the way water changes direction around a stone. Heads turning by degrees. Whispered exchanges. The recognition banquet had continued its formal progression, but there was a secondary conversation happening in the room now, conducted in glances and tilted heads, and the particular tension that fills a space when something unexpected has disrupted the expected order of things. Edric was looking at her. She felt that too, though she did not turn to confirm it. There was a quality to his attention, something tighter than curiosity, something that had not been there an hour ago, when she had been simply invisible to him. She recognized it not because she had felt it directed at her before, but because she had read it on other faces in other moments. It was the specific discomfort of a man who had undervalued something, and was only now, watching someone else show interest in it, beginning to calculate what that undervaluation had cost him. Too late, she thought. And the thought carried no satisfaction, only a tired sort of clarity. "Why are you still here?" said a voice behind her. Not Calder. Not Fen. Rose turned. Theron stood perhaps 4 feet away. He had moved without sound, which should not have been possible for a man of his size, but apparently was, because she had not heard a single footstep. Up close, the detail she noticed first was the scar. A thin, pale line that ran from the outer corner of his left eye toward his jaw, old enough to have faded to silver, the kind of mark left by something with claws rather than a blade. His eyes were darker than she had expected from across the room. Not blue, exactly. The color of a sky 2 minutes before a storm decides what it will do. He was not looking at Calder or Fen. He was looking at her. "I beg your pardon," she said. "You were walking toward the door," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, with the economy of someone who had long ago decided that every word should earn its place before being spoken. "You stopped. I'm asking why." Rose held his gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. "You walked in," she said, because again, it was simply true. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. It didn't reach that. But a slight change in the set of his jaw, as though something she said had landed in a place he had not fully expected it to reach. "Calder," he said, without looking away from Rose. Said Calder behind her. What did she smell like, from the door? A pause. Rose felt a rise of heat in her face that she refused to let show on it. "Cedar," said Calder, and his voice had lost the easy amusement from before, replaced by something more considered. "And something older, something I can't name exactly." "Neither could I," said Theron. And now he did look away. Briefly, toward the center of the hall, where the recognition ceremony was wrapping to its close, where Edric stood accepting congratulations, beside Mira Sorn and her silver-threaded gown. His expression when he looked at that scene was not contemptuous. It was simply absent of any warmth whatsoever, in the way that a stone wall is absent of warmth. Not because it dislikes you, but because warmth was never part of its composition. He looked back at Rose. "You're from Cinderfen," he said. "Yes. You came here tonight expecting to be claimed. It was not phrased cruelly. It was phrased the way a man states a coordinate on a map, locating something precisely because precision is useful. But the words still had weight, and Rose felt them land against her chest. "I came because I was invited," she said carefully. "The expectation was perhaps something I built on my own." "The man who invited you," Theron said, with a slight tilt of his head toward the center of the hall, "is an idiot." The word was so plainly delivered, so utterly without performance, that Rose almost laughed. She caught it in time, but the corner of her mouth moved without her full permission. "He made a practical choice," she said. "A practical choice suggests he weighed the options accurately." Theron's gaze was steady, direct, and not unkind, though it was not soft either. It was the look of someone telling you a factual thing, not trying to comfort you with it. He didn't, which makes him an idiot. Senna made the small sound again, beside Rose. Rose did not look at her. The hall was growing warmer with bodies and wine and the noise of the banquet resuming its social current after the formalities. Someone near the hearth had begun to play a stringed instrument, a low, wandering melody that moved beneath the conversation like water under ice. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchens beyond the far wall. Rose became aware, with a clarity that felt almost cold, of her situation in its most stripped-down form. The recognition was over. She had not been claimed. She had no alliance to bring back to Cinderfen, no bond to negotiate. No reason to remain in this hall except the fact that leaving now would mean walking back through the dark toward a pack that was already poor, already small, already quietly struggling through each winter, with less than the winter before. Her mother's clay jar was empty. The dress she wore was the sum total of everything she had built toward this night, and she was standing, somehow, in conversation with the Alpha King. "I have a question," she said. Theron waited. He seemed very good at waiting. "Your lands," she said. "The king's territory. Does it include farmland? Working land?" Calder went still behind her. Even Fen, who had been watching the hall with his usual air of cataloging everything, turned back to look at her directly. Theron's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes did. A deepening of attention, like a flame given more air. "It does," he said. Rose folded her hands in front of her, a gesture her mother had taught her for moments when you needed to look composed, even when your pulse was doing something irregular. "If you let me stay," she said, and her voice was entirely level. "I'll work on your farm. I know crops. I know soil and season and how to read weather by the way the clouds move in the morning. I'm not asking for charity. I'm offering labor in exchange for ground to stand on." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of Calder's suppressed reaction, of Fen's careful attention, of the noise of the hall continuing around them as though this conversation were not happening at all. Theron looked at her for a long moment. "You're about to tell me no," she said, reading something in the stillness of his face. "Was I?" he said. And that was not an answer, but it was something else. Something she filed away carefully, like a coin dropped into a jar beneath a floorboard, small and certain and worth keeping. Theron was quiet for long enough that the stringed instrument near the hearth completed a full phrase and began another. Then he said, "What do you know about the northern soil?" Rose blinked once. Of all the responses she had prepared herself to receive, a polite dismissal, a confused silence, even laughter, that was not among them. "It's dense," she said, adjusting quickly. "Harder to break in spring. Holds moisture longer, which means root vegetables do better than grain in wetter years. You have to read the season earlier, because the thaw comes later and leaves less margin." Calder turned to Fen. The look between them was brief and wordless, and communicated something Rose could not fully translate, though it had the texture of two people confirming something they had privately suspected. "My head groundskeeper has been trying to solve a drainage problem on the eastern field for 2 seasons, Theron said. His voice gave nothing away. He might have been discussing the weather, or the price of timber, or absolutely nothing at all. "He's a good man, not a flexible thinker. Drainage problems in dense northern soil are usually about compaction," Rose said. "You don't solve them by digging deeper. You solve them by changing what grows along the edge. Deep-rooted plants break the layer underneath. It takes 1 full season of patience before you see results." Another silence. Shorter this time. "You've done this," he said. "My pack's land was not generous," she said. "We learned to make it work, or we didn't eat." "I learned to make it work." For the first time, something crossed Theron's face that was not quite neutral. A shift too controlled to be called an expression, but present nonetheless, like light moving behind a shutter. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at maps, not admiring them exactly, but reading them with the full weight of his attention and filing what he found in a place he would not forget. "You can stay," he said, simply, finally, the way someone closes a ledger after making an entry, not with flourish, but with the finality of a decision made and recorded. Rose released a breath she had not entirely been aware of holding. "As a member of the working household," he continued, and there was something deliberate in how he held her gaze while saying it, something that suggested the words were a formality being observed, not a boundary being drawn. "You'll have quarters, meals, and fair compensation for your labor. In return, I'd like you to speak with Aldrich, my groundskeeper, before the first frost." "I can do that," she said. "Good." He looked briefly toward Calder. "Find her and her companion suitable lodging in the East Wing when we return." Then back to Rose, as if completing an ordinary logistical exchange. "We leave at first light." He turned and walked back toward the center of the hall, with the same unhurried authority he had arrived with, and the room parted around him without anyone appearing to consciously decide to move. Rose stood very still for a moment. Then Senna grabbed her arm with both hands and leaned in close to her ear. "Rose," she whispered, with the compressed intensity of someone screaming in a library. "Do you understand what just happened?" "I think so," Rose said quietly. "The Alpha King just said yes." "I was there, Senna." "You asked the Alpha King if you could work on his farm, and he said yes." "I'm aware." "Like it was nothing, like you just asked him to pass the bread." "I find it's easier to ask for things when you ask for them plainly." Senna stared at her for a moment, with the expression of someone who had known a person their entire life and was only now understanding that they had consistently underestimated them. Then she laughed, a short, private sound, and squeezed Rose's arm. "Your mother would have said something insufferable right now about how she always knew." Rose smiled. It was small, and it was real, and it was the first completely real thing she had felt since walking into that hall. She was still holding that small warmth when she heard footsteps behind her. Measured, familiar. "Rose." She turned. Edric stood 2 feet away. Without the distance of the hall between them, and without the buoyancy of his earlier performance, he looked younger than she remembered him being. His jaw was set with the particular tension of someone who has prepared a speech and is now uncertain it will land the way he intended. "Edric," she said. Her voice was even. She was grateful for that. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You don't, actually." He blinked. "I made you a promise." "You made a suggestion," she said. "At a riverbank. To a woman you thought had no other prospects." She kept her tone measured without cruelty, but without softness either. "I don't think you made it with bad intentions. I think you made it without thinking carefully about what it would mean if you kept it, and what it would mean if you didn't." Something moved across his face, the beginning of an argument that he seemed to think better of. "The alliance with Venner," he started, "is important to your pack." She nodded. "I understand that. Truly." She paused. "But I came here tonight in a dress my mother started saving for before she died, because a man told me to come and implied he would stand beside me in front of everyone. And he didn't." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to feel guilty forever about that, Edric. I'm asking you to understand the size of it before you decide an explanation is what the moment needs." The silence between them was different from the silences with Theron. That one had been full of something moving. This one was the sound of something settling, like a door that has been opened too long finally finding its frame. Edric looked at her for a moment in which Rose thought she saw something genuine. Not love, and not regret exactly, but the specific sorrow of a person who has recognized too late what they were actually looking at when they thought they were looking at something ordinary. "You're leaving with the King's company," he said. It was not quite a question. At first light, she said. He nodded, slowly. The calculated ease he had worn all evening was entirely gone now, and what remained was simply a man who had made the convenient choice and was standing in the shadow of it. He turned without saying anything further and walked back toward the center of the hall. Senna watched him go. She said. Don't, said Rose. I wasn't going to say anything. You were going to say something. I was going to say that he'll spend the next 10 years thinking about tonight. That's not useful to either of us. It's a little useful to me, Senna said, and Rose gave her a look that made her press her lips together over a smile. They were guided to the east wing by a young man from Theron's company, barely older than 20, with red hair and the quiet efficiency of someone trained to complete tasks without requiring direction. He introduced himself as Pell, and said nothing beyond what was necessary, which Rose appreciated. He showed them 2 small adjoining rooms, plain but clean, with actual mattresses stuffed with dried grass and wool blankets folded at the foot of each bed. There was a water basin on the table, and a narrow window that looked out toward the forest. Rose sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the distant sounds of the banquet still winding through the hall below. Music, voices, the occasional burst of laughter that echoed up through the stone floors. She had arrived in that hall tonight with a hope shaped like a specific thing, and that thing was gone. But she was not going back to Cinderfin empty. She was going somewhere she had never been, offered by a man who had given her more honest attention in 5 minutes than she had received from anyone in that hall all evening. She did not know what to make of Theron yet. He was not what she had expected a king to be. She had imagined something louder, more performative, more conscious of its own legend. What she had found instead was a man who used silence the way other men used armor, and who asked questions with the precision of someone who already suspected the answer and was simply verifying it. She lay back and stared at the ceiling of the stone room. Cedar, Calder had said, and something older. Something I can't name exactly. She did not know what that meant. She had never thought much about her own scent. It was not something omegas from small packs tended to analyze. You smelled like your pack, like your land, like the work you did and the season you were in. That was all. But she thought about the way Theron had gone still for just a fraction of a second when he'd asked the question, and the way Calder had answered it, not with dismissal, but with something that sounded, if she was reading it correctly, like genuine puzzlement. She filed it away, like a coin in a jar. She was almost asleep when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, unhurried, deliberate, pausing briefly in front of her door, then continuing past. She recognized the quality of them immediately. Not from sound alone, but from the same instinct that had known to stop moving when the door to the great hall had swung open. She did not know why Theron had paused outside her door. She did not know what he had been thinking in that moment, or whether it meant anything at all. But she lay there in the plain room with the wool blanket pulled to her chin and the sounds of the banquet fading below, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, even though she could not yet explain why. They left at first light, as promised. The morning was gray and cold, the kind of cold that lives in the bones of autumn and refuses to be reasoned with. Rose stood in the courtyard of the Draveth stronghold with Senna beside her and a small bundle of belongings at her feet. A change of clothes, a comb, the clay jar that was now empty, but that she had wrapped in cloth and carried anyway, the way you carry certain things not for their use but for what they mean. The horses were being readied by Theron's men, breath fogging in the dawn air, hooves loud against the stone. Calder appeared at her side with a cup of something hot and pressed it into her hands without a word. She looked at him. "You look like someone who needs something warm before a long ride," he said. "I'm perceptive that way." "Thank you," she said, and meant it simply. He nodded and moved off to bother Fen about something, and Rose drank the tea. It was bitter and herbed, with a faint taste of pine resin. and watched the company assemble with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this many times. There were 12 riders in total, including Theron's personal guard, 4 silent men in dark leather who positioned themselves around him, not with obvious ceremony, but with a natural precision, like water finding its level. Theron himself stood near the lead horse, a large, dark animal, black as pitch with one white front foot, reviewing something on a folded piece of parchment with the focused attention he seemed to give everything. He had not looked up when Rose came into the courtyard. He did not look up now. Pell materialized beside her and showed her to a brown mare with a calm eye and a patient mouth. Rose mounted without assistance, adjusting the stirrups herself. Senna was helped up by one of the younger guards, who turned very red afterward and found something urgent to attend to on the other side of the courtyard. Senna pretended not to notice with the gracious expertise of someone who had been making other people comfortable her entire life. They rode north. The road out of Draveth territory moved through dense forest, silver birch and old oak pressing close on either side, the canopy still thick enough to filter the morning light into pale, moving columns that crossed the road ahead of them. The smell of wet leaves and dark soil rose up from the ground with every hoofbeat. Rose breathed it in and felt something in her chest begin to ease, the way a clenched hand slowly opens when the reason for the tension has passed. Calder rode up beside her after the first hour. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "The ride?" "All of it. Last night. This morning." He gestured loosely at the road ahead, the trees, the company, the general improbability of her situation. "Any of it." Rose considered the question seriously, because it seemed to deserve that. "It's a great deal to take in," she said at last. "That's a very measured answer. I'm a very measured person." He rode in silence for a moment. "You held yourself well last night, with Draveth's son." "I didn't hold myself any particular way. I just said what was true." "Most people don't," he said, with a matter-of-factness that suggested he had observed this extensively and arrived at the conclusion without much bitterness. "They dress things up, manage the surface, especially in rooms like that one, with banners on the walls and alphas measuring each other by the cut of their cloaks." He paused. Theron noticed. Rose kept her eyes on the road. "He notices a great deal," she said carefully. "He notices everything," Calder said. "He just doesn't comment on most of it. You'll learn the difference between his silences after a while. Some of them mean nothing. Some of them mean he's already made a decision and is waiting to see if you'll reach the same conclusion on your own." "Which kind was last night?" she asked. Calder smiled, looking ahead. "The second kind," he said, and then nudged his horse forward before she could follow up. They arrived at the king's territory as the sun was beginning its descent, the light turning the color of cooling embers. The road widened as the forest thinned, giving way to open land, broad fields in the last stages of the harvest season, pale and golden and streaked with shadow. Stone walls ran along the edges of the fields. Old walls, built by hands long before the current generation, repaired in sections with newer stone that hadn't yet weathered to match. Beyond the fields rose the stronghold. It was not a castle in the ceremonial sense. There were no decorative towers, no banners hung purely for display. It was a structure built entirely for purpose, wide, low, deep-rooted in the hillside, with thick stone walls the color of charcoal and narrow windows fitted with iron. Torches were already burning in the brackets along the outer wall, and the smell of wood smoke drifted down from the chimneys in the main building, carrying with it the faint traces of pine, cooked grain, and the particular animal warmth of a working pack in its home territory. Rose felt something when they passed through the gate, a recognition that had nothing to do with logic, the kind that lives below words, in the part of you that is still entirely wolf. This place was old, and it knew her scent. She did not say that to anyone. She filed it away in the jar, with the other things she was collecting. She met Aldrich the following morning. He was older than she expected, a compact man in his late 50s, with a weathered face that had the topography of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors reading sky and soil. He received her with the specific wariness of a craftsman being told that an outsider has been sent to look at his work, and walked her out to the eastern field without much ceremony, clearly expecting to be politely unimpressed. Rose walked the edge of the field. She crouched down twice, pushing her fingers into the dark earth, holding it, pressing it, tilting it in the morning light to look at its texture. She walked the line where the field sloped slightly downward, and stood for a moment, looking at the tree line 100 yards east, identifying the species, calculating the root behavior beneath the surface. "Your water table is too high along this edge," she said. "The field slopes toward the tree line and there's no drainage point. Every heavy rain sends water this direction and it has nowhere to go." She pointed to the section near the far stone wall where the grass grew patchy and thin. "That's not poor soil. That's saturated soil. It's been drowning the roots every wet season and then baking in the dry months. Nothing's going to grow consistently there until you redirect the water." Aldrich looked at the section she pointed to, then at her, then back at the section. "I've been planting ridge grain there to try to absorb the moisture," he said. "Ridge grain doesn't have deep enough roots to break the compacted layer below," she said. "You need something with a taproot. Nettled broom or deep fennel along the outer edge, planted in a line. One season of that and the layer breaks enough for the water to pass through. After that, you can plant what you like along this section." There was a long pause. "Where are you from?" Aldrich asked. Not rudely, the way someone asks a question when the answer has become genuinely important. "Kinderfen," she said. He looked at the field again, then turned back to her with the expression of a man who has just significantly revised his estimate of something. "Poor land." "Very," she agreed. "Which is how I learned." Something shifted in Aldrich's face. The wariness didn't vanish. It was replaced by something more complex, a respect that was still being formed, still finding its edges. "I'll get you the planting records from the last 4 seasons," he said, "if you're willing to look at them." "That's why I'm here," she said. She was walking back toward the main building when she became aware that she had been observed. Not by Aldrich. She had known he was watching throughout. But by someone standing near the stone wall at the field's northern edge, arms crossed, slightly apart from the 2 guards posted nearby. Theron had not announced himself. He was simply there, in the way he seemed to be in many places, present before you had registered the presence, watching before you had thought to wonder if you were being watched. Rose stopped walking. For a moment, they regarded each other across 30 feet of field, with the autumn light between them, and the smell of turned earth rising from the ground. "You spoke to him plainly," Theron said. His voice carried in the cold morning air without effort. "It seemed more efficient than working around it," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Aldrich has worked this land for 30 years, he said. 3 separate specialists came to look at the eastern field. They all recommended digging deeper drainage channels." A pause. "We dug them. The problem persisted. Because the problem wasn't depth," she said. "It was compaction." "Yes," he said, simply. And then, "Come to the study tonight. There are maps of the northern sections I'd like your opinion on." He turned and walked back toward the stronghold before she could answer, which seemed to settle the matter to his satisfaction. Fen appeared at her shoulder from nowhere in particular. "That," he said, in a tone of gentle significance, "is not something he says to the working household." Rose watched Theron's retreating figure. "What does he say to the working household?" "Usually nothing directly. He speaks to Aldrich. Aldrich speaks to the staff." Fen paused, appearing to choose his next words with his usual care. "He came out this morning to watch you, not the field." Rose absorbed that. She looked down at her hands. Earth still caught in the lines of her palms, under the edges of her nails. The hands of someone who had always worked, who had learned the language of soil because it was the only language available to her. "Fen," she said quietly, "the night we arrived." Calder said my scent was cedar and something older. Something he couldn't name. "Yes," said Fen. "What does that mean?" Fen was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that wasn't evasion, but preparation. "There's a bloodline," he said at last, slowly, that most packs stopped tracking 3 generations back, because there were no confirmed descendants. An old line. Pre-crest, before the pack borders were drawn the way they are now. He paused. They were called the Ashborn. He looked at her with amber eyes that held something careful and significant. Their omegas carried a scent that other wolves described as cedar and iron and old stone, something that didn't match any living pack. The word went through her like cold water. "I'm from Cinderfen," she said. "My mother was from a farming family." "I know," said Fen, "which is what makes it interesting." He left her there with the earth on her hands and the sky turning silver overhead, and a feeling in her chest like a door she had never known existed had just been found in a wall she thought she understood completely. The study smelled of old parchment and pine resin, and the particular dry warmth of a room where candles had been burning for many hours. Rose stood at the edge of the wide table where the maps were spread. Hand-drawn on heavy vellum, edges worn soft with handling, annotated in several different inks suggesting many hands across many years. The northern sections of the king's territory were marked with elevation lines and soil notations and small symbols she didn't immediately recognize, a private cartographic language developed by someone who had been mapping this land long enough to need shorthand. Theron stood on the other side of the table. He had removed the fur-lined cape and the crossed chest straps. He wore only the dark leather vest now, and the candlelight moved across the bracer on his left wrist, and the silver scar along his jaw, and the quiet steadiness of his face as he pointed to a section of the map near the northern tree line. "This section floods in spring," he said. "Every year without fail. We've lost 3 harvests in the last decade." Rose leaned forward to study the elevation markings. "The meltwater comes from the ridge," she said, tracing the contour lines with one finger without touching the vellum. "This whole section sits in a natural bowl. The water has nowhere to go, because the ground on the eastern side is too dense to absorb it, and the western side rises." "Yes." "You need a runoff channel here," she pointed, "but not dug down. Cut laterally along this slope, and let the water move west instead of pooling. The western rise is gentler than it looks on the map. The water would follow it naturally if given a path." Theron was quiet for a moment, studying where her finger had traced. Then he said, "Aldrich has been talking about the eastern field all evening." "He's a good listener," she said. "Once he decided I wasn't going to waste his time." "It takes him a while to decide that." "It took him about 10 minutes," she said. Something crossed Theron's face. Brief, warm, gone before she could fully name it. "He told me 20, he said. She looked up from the map. They were closer together than she had registered, the width of the table between them, but the candlelight making the space feel smaller, more particular. "Fen told me about the Ashborn," she said. She had decided on the walk up to the study that she would say it directly, because that was the only way she knew how to say things that mattered. "He said you'd been thinking about it." "Since the door," Theron said. No hesitation. "You smelled it when I was walking toward the exit." "Yes." "And you thought—" "I thought it wasn't possible," he said. "And then I thought that the things I've been most wrong about in my life were the things I was certain weren't possible." He held her gaze with the directness she was beginning to understand was simply how he was. Not aggressive, not performative, but fully present in a way that most people never managed. "My grandfather kept records. His grandfather before him. The Ashborn line was documented through 6 generations, and then the trail ended. There were no confirmed descendants. Most packs stopped looking." I'm from Cinderfen, she said again. The way you repeat the thing you know to be true when everything around it has become uncertain. Your mother, he said, and something in his voice shifted, became more careful. Do you know where she was from originally? Rose thought of the clay jar, the floorboard. A woman who saved coins for years without saying exactly what they were for. A woman who embroidered wildflowers on a gray-blue dress with hands that no longer saw very well, and never explained how she knew the stitches for those particular flowers, the ones that didn't grow anywhere near Cinderfen. She never said. Rose answered quietly. She came to Cinderfen before I was born. She didn't talk about what came before. Theron crossed to the bookshelf along the eastern wall, floor to ceiling, packed with volumes in varying states of age, and withdrew a book from the third shelf. He placed it open on the table beside the maps. The page showed a hand-painted illustration. A woman in a plain dress, fair-haired, with a single wildflower pressed flat beside the painted image. Beneath it, written in faded ink, was a name Rose did not recognize. But the flower was a field violet, small and slightly asymmetrical, exactly like the ones embroidered along her neckline. Rose sat down slowly in the chair beside the table. She was not prone to dramatic reactions. She had learned young that most things in life were better met with steadiness than with feeling. But her hands were not entirely steady when she reached out and touched the edge of the page. The Ashbourne women were known for two things, Theron said, his voice even, giving her room. Their knowledge of land and growing things, and their scent, which was identifiable across distance and which other wolves found. He paused slightly, difficult to ignore. Cedar, she said, and something older. He sat across from her. It's not a weakness in the bloodline. It's a mark. The old texts say the Ashbourne were the first Omegas to be formally recognized as pack leaders in their own right, before the hierarchy settled into what it is now. They led through knowledge, not dominance. Their packs were the most stable on record. Rose looked at the painted woman. The plain dress. The pressed flower. She thought about her mother saving coins without explaining why. Coming from somewhere unnamed. Teaching Rose to read soil and sky and season as though it were as natural as breathing, as though the knowledge were inherited rather than learned. You'll need this, her mother had said once, when Rose was young and complaining about another afternoon crouched in the field learning to test moisture depth with her fingers. Not because the land will always be yours, but because knowing the land means you're never entirely without ground to stand on. Rose had thought it was the practical wisdom of a poor woman in a poor pack. Now she thought it might have been something else entirely. What does this mean? She said. For where I am. For what you... She stopped. Started again. You didn't bring me here because of the farm. I brought you here because of the farm, he said. And because I have not smelled a scent like yours since I read about it in that book when I was 15 years old, and thought it was a story about something that no longer existed. He was quiet for a moment. Both things are true at the same time. Rose looked at him across the table. In the candlelight, with the maps spread between them and the old book open beside her hand, he looked less like a king than like a man who had been carrying something careful for a long time, and had grown very good at carrying it without showing the weight. You paused outside my door, she said. The night at Draveth. Yes. Why? He was quiet long enough that the candle nearest her guttered in a draft and steadied again. Because I had already made a decision, he said, and I was giving myself one last opportunity to reconsider it. Did you reconsider it? No, he said. And that was all. The winter came early that year, as northern winters do. Not arriving so much as settling, the way an old animal finds its place by the fire and makes clear it intends to stay. The first frost came 2 weeks after Rose had directed the planting along the eastern field's edge. Nettled broom in a careful line, tamped in by Aldrich's hands and hers together. The old man saying nothing beyond what was necessary, and communicating everything else in the way he had started handing her tools before she asked for them. By midwinter, the compacted layer below the eastern field had begun to shift. Aldrich found her in the courtyard one morning with the look of someone who had tested something and received the result he had quietly hoped for. "You were right," he said. "The broom was right," she said. "I just knew to ask it." He nodded once, turned, and went back to his work. It was, she had come to understand, the highest form of acknowledgement he offered, and she received it as such. Senna did not return to Cinderfen. She had said, on the third day in the stronghold, that she didn't see a compelling reason to go back to a leaking roof and a pack that had never quite known what to do with her anyway, and that if Rose was staying, someone sensible ought to stay with her. She had, within a fortnight, organized the supply rotation for the main kitchen with an efficiency that left the housekeeper both grateful and slightly displaced. Pell, the red-haired young man who had shown them to their rooms that first night, had taken to finding reasons to be near the kitchen at mealtimes, which Senna acknowledged with the same gracious expertise she applied to everything. The formal recognition happened on the last clear night before the heavy snows came, not in a grand hall, not in front of competing pack banners or calculating fathers or men who measured their choices in alliances. In the courtyard of the stronghold, under a sky so crowded with stars it looked structural, Theron stood before his company. Calder, Fen, Aldrich, Pell, the guards who had become faces Rose now knew by name, and spoke the words of the old acknowledgement. Not the modern version, not the abbreviated ceremony performed at recognition banquets. The old form. The Ashbourne form, as Fen had quietly told her when he showed her the passage in Theron's library 2 weeks before. He pressed his fingers to the back of her neck. The gesture that in the old language meant "I see you, I have chosen, I do not intend to unchoose," and said her name once. Rose. Simply, without decoration, in a voice that reached everyone in that courtyard and required no amplification, because it carried the full weight of a man who had never once in his life said something he did not mean. She pressed her hand flat against his chest in return, over the steady beat beneath the leather, the way the old text said the Omega responded when the recognition was accepted freely and without compulsion. Calder made a sound that he would later categorize as a dignified expression of approval. Fen said nothing, but when Rose glanced at him, his amber eyes held the particular warmth of someone who had known a thing was true for a long time and was relieved to watch the world catch up to it. Aldrich stood with his hands behind his back and his weather-worn face aimed somewhere in the middle distance, not at them, with the expression of a man feeling more than he intended to show. Senna cried quietly and did not apologize for it. News traveled, as news does. By the time the snows deepened, the packs had heard. Not through announcement. Theron made no announcement. He did not need to. The Ashbourne bloodline, confirmed and alive, recognized by the Alpha King in the old form. That kind of information found its own way through the territories, moving from Alcatia to Alcatia on the tongues of riders and traders, and the particular underground current of wolf society that had always moved faster than any formal messenger. In Draveth, Edric heard it over dinner from his father, who had heard it from the Venner representative, who had heard it from someone who had been present at the Cinderfen Omega's formal recognition. Edric set down his cup and said nothing for a long moment. His new companion, Mira Sorn, with her silver-threaded gown and her strategic smile, looked at him from across the table with the sharp intuition of someone who understood she was watching her husband think about a door he had closed himself. He never mentioned Rose's name after that evening, but certain silences, Senna had once said, are louder than anything spoken, and Edric Draveth spent the rest of that winter in one of the loudest silences Rose had ever been told about secondhand. Spring came, as it always had, because the world was not changed by the events of one season, even when those events were significant. The eastern field drained cleanly for the first time in 4 years. Aldrich stood at its edge on the morning the meltwater moved through rather than pooled, his boots dark with good wet earth, and watched the water find the path it had been given with the satisfaction of a man who has waited a long time to see a thing done correctly. Rose stood beside him. the stronghold rose behind them in the early light. From one of the upper windows, she knew without looking, Theron would be at his table with his maps and his records, and the quiet industry of a man who led not by spectacle, but by consistent, careful attention to the things that actually mattered. She had the clay jar on the windowsill of their room now, still empty. She kept it there not because she needed to fill it, but because it was the right shape for what it had always been, a record of small certainties accumulated over time, proof that the habit of keeping was its own form of faith in the future. She pressed her fingers into the dark northern soil and felt it give back. Rich and ready, the way good ground does when the thing that was blocking it has finally been cleared away. This, she thought, was what her mother had meant. Not just knowing the land, never being without ground to stand on. She stood up, brushed the earth from her hands, and went home.